Okay, let's say our La'asuk B'divrei Torah blessing together. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Ishanu
B'mitzvotov
V'tzivanu La'asuk B'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has made us holy with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. So, we start off with a picture from a bus in Jerusalem. I bring you this picture. It is from my trip last summer, and I knew I was teaching this class, so I took this picture, and it comes here to show you that there is an Esther Hamalka Street in Jerusalem, Esther the Queen Street, that you can go to in Jerusalem. So this might be a very old story, but it has an effect on the landscape of Jerusalem today. It is in the Talpiot neighborhood, and you can get there on the 74, 75, and 7 buses. All right. Let's do some reading. Norma, would you read Esther on 1 foot, please?
Esther is the main character in the biblical book of Esther. We read this story on the Jewish holiday of Purim. The book dates to the later Persian period, 400 to 333 BCE, and may have been written to respond to the condition of living in the diaspora.
Great. All right. Any questions about what we have so far?
She is the main character. How come the evil one's name appears more frequently?
I don't actually know if that's true.
Seems to be anyway.
But I will,
maybe a little less evil, maybe a little less good can overcome a lot of evil.
That's true.
I have a really quick question. Just because the topic of like the age of the text was described, do we know if it was specifically composed in or outside the land of Israel?
Yeah. So there's a couple of theories on this one. The text itself, as we will eventually see, seems to suggest that Esther and possibly Mordecai wrote down these events. So it was originally composed outside of the land of Israel. There was some dispute in the Talmud about whether or not to include this in the biblical canon. You can find that in Tractate Megillah, which is about Purim, among other things, 7a, section 7, or Surgia 7 to 19. And part of how they said that this was okay to include was they said, well, Esther might have composed it, but she didn't have the Holy Spirit with her when she did so. You can only compose things with divine inspiration inside the land of Israel. So the men of the Great Assembly were the ones who actually wrote it down in its final form, and that's why we can have it included, given that God's not mentioned once, at least explicitly. So, and then there are also people who think that maybe Nehemiah was the one who wrote it down because he came from Persia and he would have known about the Persian court, and there are a lot of details about the Persian court that scholars agree somebody must have known what they were talking about when they wrote this thing. So he's a candidate possibly as well for having written it down in the land of Israel as a less about the diaspora and more about God will help us overcome those who wish us harm. So what, Barry?
When you say Great Assembly, you mean the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin?
No, in Pirkei Avot, which is a collection of quotes from the rabbis, dating from 200 BCE to 200 CE. It's part of the Mishnah in the Talmud. It records the chain of transmission from Moses to Joshua to the elders to maybe the prophets, and then the men of the Great Assembly. And so they're considered the forerunners of the Sanhedrin, of the leadership of the land of Israel, of the Jewish community.
Thank you.
Yes. So, Gabriel, I'm sorry I don't have a complete definitive answer about whether or not this was written in the land of Israel. Scholars have not come to a conclusion by themselves yet on the matter.
Thank you.
Yep. Other questions about Esther on 1 foot before we get into the actual story? All right. Seeing none. Abba, would you read our prologue, Esther chapter 1, please?
It happened in the days of Ahasuerus, that Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus occupied the royal throne in the capital Shushan, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all the officials and courtiers, the administration of Persia and Media, the nobles and the governors of the provinces in his service. For no fewer than 180 days, he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. Oy. At the end of this period, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace garden for all the people who lived in the fortress Shushan, high and low alike. There were hangings of white cotton and blue wool, caught up by cords of fine linen and purple wool, 2 silver rods and alabaster columns. There were couches of gold and silver on a pavement of marble, alabaster, mother of pearl, and
up to the top,
mosaics. Royal wine was served in abundance, as befits a king, in golden beakers of varied design. And the rule for drinking was no restrictions, for the king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with each man's wishes. In addition, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for women in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he ordered Mehuman, Bizeta, Charvona, Bigta, Avagra, Zetar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs in attendance on King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing just a royal diadem, to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by these eunuchs. The king was greatly incensed, and his fury burned within him. Then the king consulted the sages learned in procedure.
to the top.
Learned in the times, literally. For it was the royal practice to turn to all who were versed in law and precedent. His closest advisors were Karshena, Shatar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Arsena, and Memuchan, the 7 ministers of Persia and Media who had access to the royal presence and occupied the first place in the kingdom. What, yes, shall be done according to law to Queen Vashti for failing to obey the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs? Thereupon Memuchan declared in the presence of the king and the ministers, Queen Vashti has committed an offense not only against her majesty, but also against all the officials and against all the peoples in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will make all wives despise their husbands, as they reflect that King Ahasuerus himself ordered Queen Vashti to be brought before him. but she would not come. This very day the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will cite it to all your majesty's officials, and there will be no end of scorn and provocation. If it please your majesty, let a royal edict be issued by you, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be abrogated, that Vashti shall never enter the presence of King Ahasuerus. And let your majesty bestow her royal state upon another, who is more worthy than she. Then will the judgment executed by your majesty resound throughout your realm, vast though it is, and all wives will treat their husbands with respect, high and low alike. The proposal was approved by the king and the ministers, and the king did as Memucan proposed. Dispatches were sent to all the provinces of the king, to every province in its own script, and to every nation in its own...
Sorry, still at the bottom.
language, that every man should wield authority in his own home and speak the language of his own people.
Okay, thank you. So this is chapter 1 of the biblical book of Esther. Because it doesn't deal with Esther, I have dubbed it our prologue for tonight, and we do not have questions that I have posed, but if you have questions, this is a good time about chapter 1, this is a good time to raise them, and we will discuss them.
I have a question.
Okay.
It's a question about what is written, at least in the English, and what Neil said, going back to what Vashti wore. And it says she wore a diadem. Neil said she wore only a diadem. So my question, and I
You're correct,
remember
Alan.
hearing at least that she was forced to, or yeah, that she was forced to appear naked. And that was one of the reasons why she refused to appear. So I guess my question is, what does the Hebrew say? And is what Neil, and if it doesn't say only, is that, you know, in commentaries or in, you know, is it somewhere else?
Yeah, so verse 11, Lehavi et Vashti hamalka, to cause to come, to bring Vashti the queen, lifnei hamelech, before the king, becheter malchut, in her crown of royalty. Leharot ha'amim v'hasrim et yofya, in order that the people and the ministers will see her beauty, ki tovat mar'eh hi, because good to look at was she. So the Hebrew says that she came wearing, that she was supposed to come wearing her crown. The Midrash says only her crown. It's not actually in the text.
Okay.
This is a, as we will see as we go through, particularly chapter 2, the story of Esther is somewhere between PG-13, R, and X-rated, depending on who's actually telling it. And we clean it up for the kids, but this is a detail where it's gotten more provocative in the telling with the text doesn't even say it. Like, we leave out the stuff that the text does say, and somehow this detail from the commentary or from the Midrash has gotten into it. So it's very curious how this has all gone down. But I will see if I can track down that reference and bring it.
Okay.
May I make a comment?
Please.
I'll go after that.
As a woman, I gotta tell you, you know, and I believe all the women on this call can probably relate to what I'm gonna say. Even fully clothed, it is humiliating to be walking down the street and have men call out comments on how you look, even if they're supposedly compliments about your body and that sort of thing. It's just humiliating. And you can imagine this woman being called into scores of drunken men to be ogled and, you know, whatever. And you can imagine King Ahasuerus was also going to do his little, you know, touching and feeling and displaying his intimacy with her, even if she were fully clothed. So the idea was here was to make him look great. And whether she was humiliated or not was insignificant, whether she was fully clothed or naked.
Well taken. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Amen.
Quick comment.
Very.
Not to disagree with Diane. I don't disagree with Diane. And Ellen raises a good question. I was thinking more of a rule of construction type of situation, where, as a corollary to rules of construction, this is a situation where it specifies diadem, and it doesn't say anything else about any other clothing or articles of wearing. So one can draw the inference that she wasn't wearing anything else because it specified one thing and nothing else. But it's honestly, it's philosophically an open question, but the rules of construction might say you can deduce this. I think the Cantor did well.
Thank you, Barry. I think your point is well taken, and maybe what they were thinking of. And also, the default is to assume that you are coming in wearing clothing. Like, we don't say, come, let's go for a jog, make sure to bring a water bottle, and assume that therefore, because we didn't say that you should bring shoes, that you are not wearing shoes. So I see your way of approaching the text, and it may be what the commentators were looking at, and by the law of assumptions and defaults, there may be another way of looking at it as well. All right, let's go on to chapter 2 and actually get to Esther, unless there are any other comments about Vashti in chapter 1. Okay, seeing none and hearing none. All right, so Act 1 of the story of Esther, chapter 2. All right, Alan, would you read this chapter, please?
Sure. Sometime afterward, when the anger of King Ahasuerus subsided, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province of your realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins at the capital Shushan in the harem under the supervision of Hege, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women. Let them be provided with their cosmetics, and let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti." The proposal pleased the king, and he acted upon it. In the capital Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordecai, son of Yair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with King Jeconiah of Judah, which had
the top.
which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He was foster father to Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's order and edict were proclaimed, and when many girls were assembled in the capital Shushan under the supervision of Haggai, Esther too was taken into the king's palace under the supervision of Haggai, guardian of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he hastened to furnish her with cosmetics and her rations, as well as with the 7 maids who were due from the king's palace, who were her due from the king's palace. And he treated her and her maids with special kindness in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had told her not to reveal it. Every single day, Mordecai would walk about in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was faring and what was happening to her. When each girl's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus at the end of the 12 months treatment prescribed for women, for that was the period spent on beautifying them. 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and with women's cosmetics. And it was after that that the girl would go to the king. Whatever she asked for would be given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. She would go in the evening and leave in the morning for a second harem in charge of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, guardian of the concubines. She would not go again to the king unless the king wanted her, when she would be summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go to the king, she did not ask for anything but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women, advised. Yet Esther won the admiration of all who saw her. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his grace and favor more than all the virgins. So he set a royal diadem on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. The king gave a great banquet for all his officials and courtiers, the banquet of Esther. He proclaimed a remission of taxes for the provinces and distributed gifts as befits a king. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai sat in the palace gate, but Esther did not reveal her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had instructed her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai's bidding, as she had done when she was under his tutelage. At that time, when Mordecai was sitting in the palace gate, Bigtan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and plotted to do away with King Ahasuerus. Mordecai learned of it and told it to Queen Esther, and Esther reported it to the king in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated and found to be so, and the 2 were impaled on stakes. This was recorded in the book of annals at the instance of the king.
Thank you. All right, that was a lot. So,
question. Got lots of questions tonight. It seems unusual, or I'm assuming King Ahasuerus only had one wife. And it seems unusual at that time that there'd only be one wife, unless I'm just very unfamiliar with Babylonian marriage practices.
Okay, I apologize. Don't know what happened there, but I bring back the screen share. You heard the chapter. What might Esther have been thinking about during any point in that chapter? And what might she have been feeling? These are the questions that we're discussing this time. What might she have been thinking, and what might she have been feeling?
She wanted to save her people, and maybe the king had the authority to do that.
I'm going to push on that for a second. Save her people from what at this point?
Save the Jews from being destroyed by Haman's plans.
We haven't met Haman yet.
I know, but I'm speaking ahead.
Okay.
I've heard the story before.
You've heard this one before. Okay.
A few times, yeah.
I would just like to say, from the point of view of a woman, it would be really unique and nice if the Megillah, when it said Ahasuerus loved her more than the other virgins, you would hope it was more than just her beauty that he loved, that he loved other traits about her. And it would be lovely and unique if the Megillah actually spelled out what he loved about her. All we care about is her looks. I don't believe that is possibly the truth, but that's what stands out for me.
Yep.
I have a question.
Although one thing that strikes me is in response to that is it talks about how she impressed the overseer of the first harem with her, and that was her inner and in fact she impressed everybody. So I think her inner beauty was there and came out, although it's not stressed throughout the whole story, but I think in this particular chapter, and I forget specifically which verse that it talks about, but it says how, you know, he was so impressed, and it looks like the men in charge took her under their wings and protected her and gave her what she needed, because when it said she got her 7 servants due her from the castle, you can imagine bringing in hundreds of women, or however many women it was. You know, it's like trying to catch up and provide them everything they're supposed to be due. And she kind of got bumped up to the head of the line. And it seemed it was more her inner attributes that impressed them, because I'm sure there were many beautiful women there. Just the thought.
I hope you're right.
All right. Zoya, did you have a question? So somebody.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. First, I was always wondering, like, what happened to her parents? Like, you know, and then was she always an only child? And then I guess my other question is, you know, it said in the text that the maidens went to him in the evening and they came out in the morning. So did Esther do the same thing?
Well, based off of verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his grace and favor more than all the virgins. So he set a royal diadem on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Like, the way I read that, it looks like she was she was set to follow everybody else's plan, and then she became queen, and that process got interrupted.
Okay.
I think we're missing something really important when we're reading this.
Please.
Nobody has the least bit of concern about how Esther feels about Ahasuerus. It's only about how he feels about her. He loves her the best. She's the most beautiful. How about what she feels about him? It doesn't play into anything.
No, that is the question that I am posing to you. What is she feeling or thinking during this chapter?
She's being victimized by all these men who are telling her you're beautiful and you're wonderful and we're going to convey everything on you. But nobody asks her whether she wants it. And I
didn't have a
consider
choice.
that just a total tragedy in this story.
None of the young women had a choice if what they wanted. If they were told, it was a decree from the king, and they had to do what they were told.
Right, and that's the problem.
Exactly, because it's not, it's a men's world, and men ruled the way they wanted to rule.
Right. So when
And he
we're
was the
looking
king.
at how Esther felt about this, I'm coming to the conclusion that Esther would have liked to have been asked. Do you
I
want
think
this?
so. Yeah,
Do you
she was
not want this?
petrified.
Yeah.
She was petrified, a young maiden who's never been with anybody, and all of a sudden she was told she has to go to be the king, be with the king. From my understanding, was an old and fat and ugly, and you mean she was beautiful, and who wanted to be with that?
One thing she might also be thinking right now, might be in relation to like maybe she's wondering how is this going to change her life. I mean, Ahasuerus, I'm pretty sure is a Persian and a Zoroastrian, probably, since I think this is during the Achaemenid dynasty. So that's a totally different religion, spirituality. Maybe she's on top of all of this. Maybe she's also wondering, well, what does this mean for my Judaism? Being in this new environment, totally separated from Mordecai, whatever her family was like, which presumably had all that Judaism. Well, what is maybe she's thinking, what is all of this going to be like in this totally new context? Maybe that is a source of anxiety for her as well, along with everything else that's going on. That would be some of my speculation.
And I think in the modern, I like Esther, so I've done a lot of studying of these things. I think in this modern world, we don't have, our concept of a harem is Hollywood. And in reality, there was very little glamour, or if you look at harems that still exist in the Middle East, and that sort of things with wealthy people, these are not glamorous situations. It's basically a dorm room. And you may be given better areas of the harem area if you're preferred by the eunuchs and that sort of thing. They may take a little bit better care of you, but at the end of the day, it's a dorm room, and it's a dorm room not only with wives, it's got mothers, sisters, children. I mean, it's a big area, and you never leave ever. You are there forever, whether you come back into his presence or not. So it's essentially a dorm room and a prison.
Well, the question that I have is, why would Mordecai put her in that situation? I mean, what was his motive? And what was his position in the Jewish community at the time?
So I don't know that Mordecai had much of a choice. Looking at verse 2, the king's servants suggest, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province of your realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins at the capital in the harem under the supervision. Let them be provided with cosmetics, and let the one who pleases you become queen. And then the king says, great, let's do it. So then, verse 8, when the king's order and edict was proclaimed, and when many girls were assembled in the capital, Shushan, under the supervision of Haggai, Esther too was taken into the king's palace under the supervision of Haggai, guardian of the women. So, at least from a surface read of this, it doesn't look like he's pulling strings at this point. Like it seems like this is an official roundup, and she gets swept up in it just like lots of other people do. Is how at least I'm reading the surface. But if someone else is reading the surface differently, I'm happy to be persuaded otherwise.
Well, what was the knowledge of anti-Semitism at the time, and that they had to feel as if they had to hide their Jewishness? She and Mordecai she didn't want to let them know that she was a Jew. So it seems like that didn't have anything to do with the situation in terms of what the king was after.
Right.
Yeah. So it became, well, I don't want to jump ahead again, but it became apparent that he was going to be helpful to her. So maybe she was using the king as well. Saw that as a way out to protect herself and Mordecai.
I keep thinking to I keep thinking to myself that if they had known that Esther was Jewish, would they have taken her to be considered as queen? I mean, did they have any idea, is what I'm wondering.
To me, yeah, go ahead, Herb.
One other question I would have is, was she the only Jewess in the kingdom? That's what they're implying, but that's not necessarily the case.
If some of the other women were also Jewish, but they were also afraid to expose their identities, maybe there were other Jewish women in the group, but she was the one who became the queen and the savior.
If King Ahasuerus is post-dating King Cyrus, if I remember correctly, David, is this Cyrus's grandson?
There's a lot of dispute about that. Maybe yes, maybe no.
Oh, is this a member of his family though?
It is assumed probably yes.
Well, then, I was assuming this is also then after the end of the Babylonian captivity.
Yes.
Maybe the anti-Semitism is something that kind of is just in the court. Perhaps it's from the court establishment even before the stuff with that comes later in the narrative. Maybe it's like a thing that just kind of occurred through maybe the priestly establishment or something. Which actually leads me to wonder, is the term for, because I see there's a lot of terms for like a courtier, something like a eunuch, is there any, what is the specific title that is used for them?
Like in the Hebrew?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, scene.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, sounds. Yeah, Cerise, Haggai, Cerise Hamelach. Cerise and Sarisim would be the title.
I was wondering because I know in the Talmud, I'm forgetting where, but there's a Persian, I was reading on Safaria, it's like a Persian loan word for some kind of court priest in like the Sassanid period. I think it's Magush. I was wondering if it's used here. I was thinking it could have been something related to like anti-Semitism in the Zoroastrian priesthood, maybe.
No, I haven't learned every chapter of the Megillah yet, but I've learned most of them, and I don't remember that term showing up. However, there are a number of Persian loan words in this text, which is why it's dated to the late Persian period in the 400s, 300s BCE.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
David, may I suggest that
Please.
when we get into these interesting granular questions, we may be taking the text a little too literally at some points, and we should perhaps bear in mind some of the satirical elements, like right back in chapter 1, in verse 19, I think, that the law, he would pass a law that could not be abrogated. But of course, a law that cannot be abrogated it limits the power of the all-powerful king, and so we don't see such laws. It's a. I'm not saying that the whole story is a joke, but built into it is this idea that the king is binding himself, even though he has total power. And I just want to suggest it could be borne in mind.
Yes, there's definitely a view on this text that it is like a caricature in some ways, or a satire, or political or social, such as the 180-day party that the king throws at the beginning of chapter 1. So yes, absolutely. Thank you.
But if the king were able to revoke a law that he made, that would appear that a king could make a mistake, and he couldn't admit that to his the people under him.
That's true.
There's another whole layer of this whole thing, which is some biblical scholars look at the connections with Babylonian and Persian mythology. Mordecai becomes Marduk, Esther becomes Ishtar, and there's a whole other slew of connections like that, which make the entire story one huge satire on the ancient pagan religions pre-Judaism.
It's true.
David, I think we also need to be careful using the term anti-Semitism. And I just started reading a book, and the first chapter talks a little bit about Babylonia. And yes, the Jews were living in Babylonia because Israel or Judea was conquered by the Babylonians, and as part of the punishment for fighting against the Babylonians, they were brought to Babylonia, which was very common then. But Babylonia was Zoroastrian, and it was a monotheistic religion, and it's a religion that still exists. But it was monotheistic, and they were far worse with cultures whose religion was polytheistic. So they were not, so I think we just need to be careful blaming everything on anti-Semitism, as opposed to just here was a people who were a conquered people, and Esther and Mordecai, or Esther was hiding who she was because she was part of this conquered people. And I wish it was a little further ahead in the book to be able to provide a little bit better commentary.
Next week.
Okay.
David, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I was taught that Ahasuerus was not king, did not have royal blood, but since he married Vashti and she was of royal blood, that's how he became king. So that is true.
No, I mean,
No.
it is true that that is something that people have said.
Okay.
However, it's not in the text.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. There is more. The rabbis not only seek to have the obvious upcoming villain be the bad guy in the story, but they, for various reasons, don't like the king and they don't like Vashti either. So they make up other reasons to make them look bad beyond what is already in the text.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Okay, other questions, comments, chapter 2, or even about what Esther might be thinking or feeling in this chapter? All right, seeing none, I will stop the recording.